As we did last week, I wanted us to do again this week, and that is, I hate to do it, but please stand back up. We're going to recite the Lord's Prayer again, like we did last week. Hopefully we'll have that on the screen. Can you guys help us out, or is it lost? Okay, let's try it without it. Ready? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Well, I'm going to put this down. If I don't have PowerPoint, there's no need to hold that in my hand. I want to talk to you guys today from John chapter 13. John chapter 13, and if anybody has a Bible, I would love one. If you turn to John 13 and hand it to me, it might actually help me this morning. But last week, I tried to talk to you all about Lazarus, and we finished up a series on Lazarus. Thank you. So we finished up a series on Lazarus, and I tried to remind us that there were three responses to the miracle of the raising of Lazarus. Jesus never went into the tomb. He just simply shouted into the tomb. And as his voice reverberated around inside, Lazarus come forth. Out Lazarus came. And they said, take the grave clothes off of him, let him go. But then it tells us in the rest of chapter 11 that people responded in three ways. The first way was many who had come to comfort Mary and Martha believed. But then it tells us after those who believed, it tells us that the chief priests and the Pharisees, they gathered to plot to assassinate Jesus. They put a bounty on his head. And you might remember that the chief priest even prophesied, it's better for one to die on behalf of the whole nation than for the whole nation to be destroyed. But the rest of that chapter tells us about a third response. And you might remember that response begins with Martha, who wanted to throw a wonderful party for Jesus. Jesus was the guest of honor. Lazarus was the host. Jesus was the guest of honor. Lazarus was the host. People came from all over to celebrate the fact that Jesus had given them their brother back. It was a marvelous party, and everyone was there, and they're celebrating the fact that Lazarus is risen from the dead. And he's sitting there with them. And you remember the rest of the story. Mary gets up and she goes into the back bedroom, wherever she has hidden this jar of perfume. And she comes back with this expensive jar of perfume worth an entire year's wages. And she breaks the jar open and she pours the whole thing on the feet of Jesus. Judas says, why did you let her do that? And he says, leave her alone. She's done a beautiful thing. She did this in preparation for my burial. So now let's fast forward just a few days to Holy Week, to the week after Jesus has had his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then we read in Matthew chapter 20 that something is going on. And in Matthew 20 and verse 20, we read about the fact that a woman named Mrs. Zebedee shows up. She shows up in Jerusalem and she tries to find Jesus, and she finally does, away from everybody else. Hey, Jesus, can I have a few minutes with you? Parent-teacher conference. And so Jesus says, yeah, what do you want? And she says, well, you know my boys. You know they're your favorites. I mean, you take them places you don't take everybody else. They've told me about all these little excursions they've been a part of. So why don't you go ahead and make one of them vice president and one of them secretary of state? Just go ahead and do it. Put one on your right and one on your left. When you start your kingdom, give them those favored seats. They deserve it, don't you think? And Jesus asked her, do you really want them on my right and on my left when I come in glory? Is that really what you want? And those seats aren't mine to give anyway. They belong to the Father. She left, but the rest of the disciples found out what she did. Everybody loves an in run and a power grab, don't you? You ever had one at work, at the office, around the family? We've all seen it, right? It just warms your heart to know somebody is going in through the back door trying to get. Yeah, it's just not fair. And so what we discover is that Jesus gathers all the disciples. So here's a mother's request. And it tells us that the disciples were indignant. And because they were indignant, Jesus gathered them all together. And he said, listen up. And this is what he said to them. And can you read the part in bold with me? He said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Even before that, if you back up to Luke chapter 14, I know I said we'd be in John 13, we will, but if you back up to Luke chapter 14, one of the things that you'll notice there is that Jesus gives some recommendations for etiquette at a great banquet. Has your mom ever told you how you should perform at a great banquet? You know, those things, Suzanne's taught me a lot. Like one of the things she taught me is BMW. Have you ever gone to one of those tables? It's a round table and there's like water glasses and bread plates and everything, and you can't figure out which one's my bread plate and which one's my water. BMW, okay? Bread, meal, water. Isn't that worth the price of the whole sermon right there for you? Bread, meal, water. So if you ever sit down and you can't remember, you just say BMW, bread, meal, water. So anyway, Jesus was trying to give etiquette to his disciples when they go to a great banquet. And you know what he said about great banquets? The first thing he said is, when you show up at a great banquet, instead of taking the best seat you can find, just go all the way to the back and take a seat at the very back. Because if you take a seat at the very back and the host sees you there and wants you somewhere else, they'll come up and say, hey, no, you don't belong back there. Come take this seat of honor. This is where we want you. But Jesus said, if you take the seat of honor, the host may be embarrassed and say, I feel really bad about this, but I already promised that seat to Denny Lloyd. You can't have it. And so you'll have to get up and kind of shirk off to the back. So Jesus says, just choose the humble seat. And then he also says, and when you're throwing a banquet, it's your turn. Think about all the people who don't get invited to banquets and invite them. Think about all the people who society would say don't belong and invite them to the banquet. That's Jesus' etiquette for going to a banquet. And so with that, let's go to John chapter 13. And when we come to John chapter 13, as was read for us, we know it was just before Passover. And Jesus knew who he was. He knew what time it was. He knew where he had come from. He knew where he was going. He knew it was time for him to depart this world. And because he loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Or some translations say he showed them the full extent of his love. How did he do that? The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, who's sitting there at the banquet, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew this. Jesus knew that the Father had put everything under his power and that he was returning to God. So, let's set the scene. the table would have looked something like this. And as everyone was walking in, they would have seen on their way into the room something that looked just like this. The only problem was there was a basin and a towel, but there was no servant. You see, ideally, there should have been a servant sitting there when each of them walked up the stairs and into the upper room. And they would have stopped as they walked in, and they would have put one foot in the basin, and it would have been washed clean. They put their other one in the basin, and there would have been a servant there to wash it clean. And then they would have gone and found their seat at the table. But no one was sitting there. There was a basin, there was a towel, but there wasn't a servant. And so nobody wanted to stop. They even could kind of pretend like they didn't see it, right? And they just went all and sat down with stinky, smelly feet. Think locker room and dinner combined at the same time. And so while they're trying to eat this wonderful food, they're getting these wafts, these explosions of smell that are coming from whatever they've walked through all day long in the city streets. And so Jesus, in the midst of the meal, gets up and he stretches. And the next thing you know, he's taken off his outer robe. He's wrapped a towel around his waist. He's poured water into the basin. And he has gone around the table and he's washing feet, drying them with the towel. Now, pretend for a moment that you were sitting there. Pretend you're one of the 12. What's your response when Jesus gets up, takes off his outer clothes, picks up the basin and the towel, and he begins to wash feet? What are you thinking? Aren't you thinking he shouldn't be doing that? I should be doing that? He's the last person on earth who should be doing that. I wish I had done it. But Jesus is there showing the full extent of his love, washing each foot, drying it with a towel. He washes every foot, and he comes to Peter. And when he comes to Peter, Peter speaks up like I probably would have and said, "Not me, not mine, not now, not ever." And Jesus said, "You don't realize what I'm doing right now, but one day you will." "No," Peter said, "don't touch my feet unless I wash your feet. You don't have any part of me." And so then Peter says, "Well, then wash all of me." He just wants to be special, doesn't he? A little bit different from everybody else. No, if your feet are washed, you're clean. But not every one of you will be clean, because he knew that one was going to betray him. And so then Jesus came back to the head of the table, and he put back on his robe and he sat back down. And when he had finished washing feet, he put that all back on and he said these words, "Do you understand what I've done for you? Do you? You call me teacher, you call me Lord, and you're right. That's who I am. Now, if I, your teacher and your Lord, have washed your feet, I did it as an example, that you might wash one another's feet. I have set you this example, that you should do what I have done." Now let me show you a couple of things that geeks like me figure out when we read the Bible, okay? If you ever want to know if you're a Bible geek, here's one of the ways you can know. Because you read this story and you listen to all the interaction that happens in John chapter 13, and what you try to do is figure out where everybody's sitting at the dinner table. And what we do is we go back into ancient history and we know how the tables were set up. We know where the host would sit. We know where the guest of honor would sit. We know where the main attendant would sit. And so we can piece together where everybody sat at this dinner table, at least these four. Jesus is host. Do you see who is in the seat of honor at this meal? Judas. That's why Jesus can say, the one that I dip this bread and give it to him, he's the one that's going to betray me. They're sharing a sop bowl. You can tell that John is sitting where he's sitting because he's able to lean in and ask Jesus a question. But what I wanted you to notice is that back in Luke chapter 14, Jesus said, when you throw a dinner party, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to look for the outcast, those that don't belong, and bless them. And Jesus used his last meal to bless the one that he knew was about to betray him. Can you picture Jesus washing the feet of the one he knew was about to get up, leave the room, and sell him out for 30 pieces of silver? Jesus shows us the full extent of his love and his forgiveness by what he does at this table. And so he closes out these words by saying, very truly I say to you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And then he closes up everything that he says with these words that I just hope stick with you today. Now that you know these things, you know what you ought to do. You know how you ought to behave. Now that you know it, Jesus says, you'll be blessed if you do them. The blessing comes in doing what you know Jesus would have you do. And so we look back to Mary and Martha and we discover that we have this opportunity to do the beautiful thing for Jesus. But then we look at Jesus and we understand that in the washing of feet, he shows us that we have the opportunity to do the servant thing for everyone else that's around us. We do a beautiful thing to honor Jesus. We do the servant thing in the name of Jesus to be a blessing to everyone else. And so I leave you with three thoughts. First, seek humility. Seek humility. Jesus says, if you can choose the lowly seat or the high seat, choose the lowly one. Number two, show up to serve. Show up to serve. And number three, wherever you go, represent. That's represent. Represent Jesus. Now that you know what you ought to do, you'll be blessed if you do it. You know, the story of each one of us is that it wasn't our feet that were dirty, it was our heart. And what we know is that the only way for our heart to get clean was for Jesus to wash it and to make it clean. And at our baptism, one of the things we know happened to each of us was that we were washed clean. Our sins were washed away, and we became the children of God. And so we live as the people who Jesus hasn't just washed our feet, he's washed every bit of us, and he has made us his children. And so now he asks the question, now that I've done it for you, can you go out and be forgiving and humble and represent me? Let's be honest. The hardest thing we will do this week is to wash the feet of a Judas who's done us wrong. The hardest thing we'll do this week is to keep being Jesus to people who have really let us down, undercut us, shown us a hateful spirit. And Jesus says, I did it so that I could do it as an example for you. And as we approach the table this morning, one of the things that we remember is that it's the story of Jesus, it's the life of Jesus, it's the cross of Jesus, it's the resurrection of Jesus that empowers us to do what we couldn't do on our own. But we can do it through the strength and the power of Jesus. If you need to be washed today, it's the right time. If you need to be made right, that's why we're here. If there's any way we can encourage you this morning, we ask you to come to the front as we stand and sing this song.